Now available in paperback and e-readers, E-Steam Ascension, The Devil's Dealer reaches a turning point in the life of this powerful E-Steam series story. Get E-Steam Ascension at online booksellers today. I was watching a Yellow Flash video and he was talking about how young adult writers need to stay out of comic books. And this is a sentiment I have heard from Diversity in Comics when he talked about Mariko Tamaki's She-Hulk run and when he talked about Gabby Rivera's America Chavez run. And when it comes down to young adult writers, this is just not the medium for them because they just don't have the skill set to write comic books. Now, one of the big mistakes that many editors at comic companies like Marvel Comics, DC Comics, Image Comics, and many others make is believing that writers can write anything. And yes, writers can write anything once they learn the skills to write in a certain medium. Because when it comes down to comics, they are very different than young adult novels. And what many editors at these comic companies believe is that this writer can adapt their skills, not understanding that it takes training and time to learn how to write in a different medium like comic books. Because when it comes down to young adult novels, they have a story model that is completely different than comic books. Now, young adult novels tell their story in prose, and they create pictures in people's mind with the prose. And usually a young adult novel sets up like this, where the story sets up within the first 3 chapters of the book, and a writer usually has between 15 and 20 pages to set up their story in a young adult novel and get the reader in. That's usually how they do things with young adult novels. Now, comics are a visual medium, and a writer has to understand how a visual medium works because a visual medium like comics is completely different than young adult novels, and it's even different than screenplays, which is also a visual medium. But because screenplays are moving pictures, it is a completely different format than comic books because comics are still images, and writing still images is completely different than writing cinematic images or prose in novels. And a lot of people think that they're the same, but they're very different, and they both, all three, have their quirks. And what happens with the young adult novelist is that they don't understand the quirks of writing comics, they don't understand the craft of writing comics, and they don't have the skill set to write comics. You just can't walk in and start writing comics unless you understand how to make the 3 act paradigm work within that medium. You have to understand that this is a visual medium, it is still pictures, and you have to make it where you're telling your story using those pictures and telling those stories in such a dynamic way that the artist can interpret what you're talking about in your words so that they can translate it into pictures that are static yet are in some ways dynamic and moving. And this is something that young adult writers really struggle with because they're just used to creating these pictures that are in the reader's imagination, but they don't understand that you have to really write out passages that help the artist be able to translate into clear visual images that, while they are static, they are moving in the reader's imagination. And the young adult authors, oftentimes, they just don't have these skills because they come in thinking that they can write comic books like a young adult novel, not understanding it's a completely different model. Because when it comes down to comics, you have to understand you usually only have about 20 pages to tell one part of this story. And usually in the first 3 to 5 pages, you have to hook the reader in. That means on the splash page, it has to be strong, it has to get the reader's attention very quickly, and you have to do that in a single image that just grabs the reader's attention. And then you have to move from panel to panel on the next page, getting the reader actively engaged into the story. And when it comes down to comics, a lot of people take that for granted. They think that this is very easy, but no, it is quite a challenge. And if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to create stories where the panels feature the wrong images or slow images or images that are very, very flat and uninspired. And when a writer doesn't know how to create that image and set that picture in people's mind, what happens is this is what leads to a really bad comic and a really bad comic book reading experience. So a writer has to know how to set up their comic very and make it move very quickly. And this is something that what most YA writers just don't know because they just don't have these skills and it takes time to learn these skills. I know this for a fact because I have had to transition from writing short stories to novels to screenplays and learning about the comic book medium. And each medium has a different set of skills. So you just can't come in and say, I wrote novels and then I'm going to just start writing comics all of a sudden. This is something that Sid Field talked about in his book Screenplay, where he said that novelists would come in and they would try to write screenplays and they would always wind up making a mess because they were trying to use the prose style of novels in screenplays when screenplays uses a very short style. The style that they use in screenplays is very, very short. So you're telling a story with the fewest amount of words. When you open a scene in a screenplay, it just may say a rundown apartment, and then sitting at a table are Bob Jones and Robert Smith and their ages and what they look like, and then that's how you're going to set the visual. In a comic, it's a different set of rules altogether because you may say, splash page, this hero is standing in front of a mirror, and then you have the title and the caption, and then you have the dialogue line, and the dialogue line might be something like, my, I sure look good tonight. That might be the caption. That's how I would set up something like an East Team Little Girl Lost, and that would be the splash page for that. But that in a novel would come across as just two sentences, but in a comic book, that's a whole single particular image that sets up the splash page, and that's how you set that up. And a lot of writers think they can go from one to the other, but if you don't know how the medium works, you're not going to be able to tell a story effectively in the medium. And when it comes down to young adult writers, they come in with a particularly weak skill set in some cases because young adult novels, they aren't that hard to write because they're very short as compared to regular novels, and the story model and the character transformation arc is a little less deeper than regular novels. So they're coming in at a disadvantage in some cases because a professional novelist, they come in with a stronger skill set, but even then, there is a learning curve as related to each different medium. So a lot of people, again, they think that a lot of editors and a lot of people think, oh, this guy wrote good YA novels, or they wrote one YA novel. They can take their skills over into comics, but if you don't know how comics work, you're going to wind up writing really bad stories like I've seen with this America series by Gabby Rivera, or that Hulk series by Mariko Tamaki, or the current run on Batgirl, where it's just a lot of exposition, a lot of dialogue, and there's no real action. When it comes down to comic books have to be big, bold, dynamic. They have to have a lot of action. This is how you get the reader's attention because the reader is looking at the pictures, and the pictures are what's telling the story. And if you can't tell the story in pictures and make pictures, these singular images, feel dynamic, then that comic is not going to get the reader turning pages. It's not going to get the reader compelled. And what's going to happen is the reader is either going to put the comic back, or they're just going to do like many of the comic YouTubers, use that comic in a roast. Because what happens is your comic just isn't strong enough. And what the money editors don't understand is these comics are getting roasted because you're recruiting writers off of Tumblr and from other places who just are out of their skill depth. When you have a comic book writer, comic book writers understand how the medium works. They understand the characters. They understand the history of the characters. And they understand the voice of the characters because they understand that this character in this comic has to remain consistent with their appearances not only in present books but in past books, and their actions have to remain consistent from past books to present books. So that means Batman has to remain Batman whether he's featured in a Superman comic, a Wonder Woman comic, a Justice League comic. That Batman has to remain the same. And when you have a character like Wolverine or any other character, they have to remain consistent from story to story to story, and their actions have to remain consistent from story to story to story, and their mission has to remain the same no matter what book they appear in. So this is something that, again, most YA writers have a hard time dealing with because they're used to, yes, they have skills writing series, but oftentimes in their series, characters go through a different character transformation arc, but comics have a comic character transformation arc where, yes, the characters go through experiences, but they don't change in the exact same way as a YA character, because a character in a YA series, they will go through a character transformation arc where everything completely changes, but in a comic book, characters go through experiences, but in some ways they stay the same. So you'll have this character, they'll go through this incredible experience, but at the end of the day, they have to go back to being whatever they were so that the next group of readers can come in and pick up on that character's adventures. And this is another thing that many YA writers struggle with as related to comics, that characters go through character transformation arcs, but at the end of the day, they oftentimes go back to being what they were. That means that they have gone through this experience, they've had these changes, but on the outside they have to remain the same, and things in their world have to remain consistently the same so that the next group of readers can come in. That means things like when Superman was working at WGBS, I believe, and was a TV reporter for a while, sooner or later he's going to go back to the Daily Planet because the readers want him to go back there so that the next generation of readers can find out what Superman is and what is related to his core foundations. He may leave and do TV reporting for a while, but then he's eventually going to go back to being what Superman is and the institutions that related to his foundation. Same thing with Captain America, maybe about 25, 30 years ago, when they had Steve Rogers give up the costume and gave it to John Walker. Eventually, after 2 or 3 years, they went right back to Steve Rogers being Captain America and going back on his adventures. Things change, and these characters go through experiences that change them, but eventually, everything eventually resets. And also, another thing related to comic book writing is that these stories do go around and come around where they're taking on the same villains. And they do this because they want the new readers to have an understanding of the character's relationship with that bad guy and the history that they have with that bad guy. So you may see them take on the same bad guy in a run at least 2 or 3 times, but that's also part of the story model. You have to understand how the story model works, and you have to understand that the hero will do this in a run, and in an overreaching arc, they may take on the same villain 2 or 3 times. And for many writers who don't understand the craft, they don't understand how it works, they don't understand that this is all part of the character's transformation arc, this is all part of their relationship, and this is all part of how comics work, because comics have a cycle for its storytelling, and that cycle is so that the new readers can have entry points where they can come in, get to know the character, get to know the character's history, get to know the character's bad guys, get to know everything about the character. And while the veteran readers are enjoying the current stories, the newer readers are finding the entry point to come in and then looking for ways to pick up the next issue and then check out the back issues. And this is all part of the writing skill set that a writer has to understand. They have to understand how this medium works. And as a writer of YA type characters, like when I do with the ISIS series, a lot of people tell me that it's a lot like a comic book. And the reason why that it is because originally ISIS was supposed to be a comic book. And when I would write the stories, I would write them in a way that would set up for 2-issue arcs and 3-issue arcs and sometimes event arcs. And what you're reading in an ISIS book would be the equivalent of reading 2 to 3 comic books. So I understood how the medium works. And I understand how to set up stories in the medium. And that's why a lot of people say, oh, your stories sound just like a comic. But that's because I've read a lot of comics, I've studied a lot of comics, and I know how the story medium works, and I know how to set things up and set up different beats. Whereas when I take a look at a lot of these books by these other YA writers, they really don't understand how the medium works. They try to use the approaches that they use for novels, for comics, and it just doesn't work because what happens is you have these long expository sequences, you have no real conflict, and you have characters which are very, very flat and don't really get any development because they're trying to write a comic like a novel and trying to get the plot point one, like when I saw it Mariko Tamaki's Hulk, where she was literally writing it like a novel and it was just going too slow. When a comic, everything has to move very quickly. You don't have that many pages to set up your action. Your action has to move by that second to third page. You really have to get people into this book very quickly, and you have to move this story along very, very quickly so that by the time they get to that 20th page, they're anticipating buying the next issue. And YA writers struggle to do that because they're used to writing a story as one volume instead of trying to write 2 to 3 comics and move things along so that people are excited throughout the book so that they're anticipating the next book. They try to write everything like it's one volume, and it leads to a very, very slow pace. And then they're writing dialogue like they're writing for a novel. And comic dialogue is completely different than screen dialogue, and it's very different than novel dialogue. Because novel dialogue, you can go 2 to 3 pages of having people talk, and YA novels, you can go in there and have 2 to 3 pages of people talking. But in a comic, you don't have that time. You don't have that space because all your images are primarily what's telling the story. So your dialogue has to be really condensed, and it has to tell us about this character and then continue to move the story forward. So those are two things that YA writers have real problems with because they're coming in from this prose style where you just have all this space, but in comics, everything is really concentrated and really condensed. And this is very similar to screenwriting because in screenwriting, everything is concentrated and condensed because 1 minute is 1 page, but in comics, it's even more condensed than that, and you have to really tell your story in a very limited space. Oftentimes, you may even have to wind up cutting things down or shortening things that you wrote in a script because it's just not going to fit on a page because you have this panel and it has a certain image on it, and the image is telling parts of the story, and you don't want parts of that story cut off. This is something that YA writers would have a hard time dealing with if they didn't understand how the medium works. And what's happening at your Marvel and even at your DC on some books like their Batgirl, that you have the YA writer and they don't understand how that works. And they don't understand that this is a very different medium, and you just can't walk into it unless you understand how it works. And the only way you're going to understand how it works is to have read a lot of comic books and to have read a lot of comic book scripts, because reading comic book scripts will really give you a sense of how things work in comics, how panels flow in comics, and how action flows in comics. Because you were looking at it one way from the comic page, but in order to get there, you have to understand how to make the words turn into the pictures so that the artist has an understanding of how to draw them. And then after they draw them, you have to understand how to make things like captions, sound effects, and dialogue work in them. So a lot of people, like editors these days, they really don't have the experience to understand that you just can't recruit a writer off the street. When it comes down to comics, comics have a skill set a writer has to learn, and in many cases, a greenhorn or a newbie has to learn the how the get the learning curve to learn how to work with the medium before they start writing in it. Now, I know from experience that when I came from novels into screenplays, there was a learning curve, and I had to go through that learning curve with screenplays, and I also had to go through it when I was starting to write comic scripts as well. So it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of frustration, but eventually you will get the hang of it, and you will learn how to go from one type of storytelling to another type of storytelling, because the whole thing that you want to do as a storyteller is make sure that people understand what you're talking about and translate it from one medium to the other. And that means you're going to have to learn how to develop the skills to do that. And this is one of the problems that a lot of these writers at Marvel right now are having, is that they're coming in and they're not learning the skills properly, because a lot of them came in out of nowhere. A lot of them really haven't read any books about writing, and a lot of them really don't have an editor there who is seasoned in the comic book medium to sit down and teach them things related to writing and how to make a story flow from page to page. And you really need that type of person there who can sit down with you and tell you, look, this script it's a little long, the dialogue is a little long, the imagery that you're putting in the script is not really clear. An artist really needs to have you be specific in what you're describing, so that they have an understanding of what to draw and what to design. Because if you're not clear, they don't know what to draw. Then everything winds up getting jumbled, and that leads to a panel that the reader has a hard time understanding. These are all skills that you learn over time, and sadly, when it comes down to a lot of editors these days, a lot of them aren't trained very well, so they don't understand that you just can't bring in somebody just to write. Yes, writers write, but they have to learn the skills to work within the medium in order to write well. If you'd like to try some of my SJS Direct publications like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, The Temptation of John Haynes, and the Smith-Dorrella trilogy, you can click the link to Amazon.com. And if you want to help me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.